So I think that really comes back to things like what we're proposing on derivatives. Putting everything on exchanges, or putting many of these contracts on exchanges, is exactly a way to get price revelation, so you know what they're worth. Putting them into clearinghouses means that the net exposure can be netted out, and somebody's sitting there saying, you need a bigger margin payment. You need to be watching the safety of these things. So I think really what you're talking about is exactly, a part of the, very much a part of how we got into this mess. And I think it's really coming back to how important it is that we put up new institutions, a new framework that'll make sure we don't get there again.
Doctor, I applaud you and the President for creating financial reform. But my question to you is this. Once you attain a goal of creating financial reform, what about accountability of people who take advantage of people who try, if you're looking forward, for as people who take advantage of people as once you pass financial reform, but do you favor more stiffer prison sentences or more severe consequences to people who violate of new financial reform?
I think that's a great question. Exactly what, I suppose the main thing you're talking about, let's think about it at the consumer side, right? Because that's a place where we see a lot of, the unfair dealing. I mean, some of it, we know there's lots of blame to go around, and some people were taking mortgages that they knew they couldn't afford, but a lot of people just hadn't really read the fine print. I think any of us that have looked at a mortgage form knows just how much fine print, and a lot of those were very complicated contracts. Exactly what the Consumer Financial Protection Agency is supposed to do is it's both going to have rule writing authority and enforcement authority, right? And the whole idea is to make sure there's one agency that has no other mandate but protecting consumers and make sure that people are obeying the rules. And I think that is something that we absolutely need precisely to make sure we have consistent enforcement. How you actually do it, what the penalties will be, I think that's why we're setting up a new framework. We want experts to figure out what's the right thing to do and how to make sure that people are protected.
Thank you. Dr. Romer, you said we have to reform our financial system through new institutions and new frameworks, and certainly an awful lot of that is going on. Bringing up the topic of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they continue to hemorrhage money, something on the order of $1 billion every 2 days, and yet we don't hear much about reforming how they basically work. We just keep paying the check, and what's more, we don't put it on the federal deficit. It's sort of off balance sheet, even though we paid the check. Could you comment on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and what we need to do there?
That's, again, a really important question. And certainly, I think what you're getting at is, though we've done a lot, there's more left to be done. And certainly when we did our plan for financial regulatory reform last June, we put out, we worked very hard and came up with what we think is a very good plan on a lot of pieces of it. And the one piece that was kind of a hole is the government-sponsored enterprises, so Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. And what we said is we're going to start a process to figure out what needs to be done. Because what's certainly true is, they certainly have been troubled. We've had to do a lot of things to keep them in decent shape. One of the ironic things is they've become even more important over this crisis, precisely because as the private sector mortgages have been evaporating, they've played a much more important role. So it absolutely is a crucial issue going forward. I'm not going to try to get ahead of the process. What I can tell you is we're working on it. So we are, at the same time we're working to get this, the core parts of the rest of regulatory reform passed, is also to then start the process for thinking about what's the best way going forward and thinking about, taking the time to think about it carefully and figure out, what's the right model for the next several decades. So we certainly have our work cut out for us.
Dr. Romer, I was listening to a radio interview with the author of 13 Bankers, and it's become a pretty popular book. And he feels that the regulatory reform is nowhere near the level of intensity that it needs to be at this time. He also feels that these mega institutions too big to fail must be broken up, and now's the time to do it, as opposed to when they're crying about, we're too big to fail. So I'd just like to hear your comment about that.
I think one of the ways you can tell that what we're proposing, what's being worked on in Congress is pretty strong, is the amount of lobbying that's coming from the industry against it. So I think that if you thought it was not going to step on some toes, it obviously is. The fundamental issue that we're trying to figure out is how do you make sure that nobody is too big to fail? How do you make sure that we don't ever find ourselves in the situation that we were in, as I described, with just this horrible choice between a bailout and a catastrophe? And that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. When we worked on our plan and sort of using, the best analysis that we could, we thought a mixture of stronger capital requirements, more transparency through things like derivatives, and making sure you have a good resolution regime so that if somebody does get in trouble, no matter how big they are, you have a sensible way to wind them down that doesn't cost the taxpayers a dime and doesn't lead to runs on other institutions. We think that is going to be enough to protect us from where we are. People will disagree. I'm sure as the legislative process goes along, we'll have a good, hearty discussion on this. We'll see where we end up. I think what everyone agrees is we want to end up in a place where we are much safer than we are now, where what happened in the fall of 2008 does not ever happen again. And that is just simply what has to be our ultimate goal.
I have a two-part question. Number one, had Lehman Brothers been forced merge, would we have been as catastrophic as we were a year ago, a year and a half ago? And second part of the question is, a lot of people believe that we're going to have a double dip in the economy, and it is more to do with the demographics rather than the demand. Would you comment on that?
So I think the first, I'm guessing that economists will spend the next decade or two kind of figuring out what went on and what would have happened if only we had done X or Y. And so the question of if we'd handled Lehman differently, how differently would the world have been? I think that's going to be a question that's going to take more research than I could describe right now. I think what we do know is that, if we'd had a framework like we're proposing, and that's really the ultimate test of this framework, is would it have prevented what went wrong in the fall of 2008? And I think having better capital requirements, making sure that everybody was thoroughly regulated, that we knew what was going on in AIG, that we knew what was going on in various financial institutions, and that we had a regime in place to deal with a Lehman Brothers when it gets into trouble, other than the sort of uncontrolled bankruptcy, I feel very confident that we would have been in a very different place. On the question of a double dip, I think one of the things, we talked a little bit about Friday's news on the GDP report. I think one of the things that we're seeing is, every additional quarter of growth, I think, means we're more firmly on the road to recovery. And so, certainly my read of the data is that the risk of a double dip is dramatically lower than it was, earlier in the recovery. That we're definitely, it's looking much more like, a genuine, solid recovery. I think the thing that has really been encouraging me, and I saw this in Friday's numbers, is the degree to which the private sector has been coming back. The whole idea of the Recovery Act was it was a bridge. It was holding up demand at a time when the private sector had really shut down. And part of what we're seeing is consumer spending again. We're starting to see firms invest into plant and equipment. I think both of those are really positive signs. And so I think the real point on us, I think if we can keep this going, if we can accelerate it, I think we are, going to see basically, there'll be bumps and wiggles, but we'll basically see pretty steady growth as we come out of this. My whole question is how fast it is, right? I'm not worried about a double dip. What I do worry is that it's not fast enough, because if we're more than 8 million jobs down relative to when this recession started. We have a big output gap. It takes not just GDP growth, it takes strong growth to add a lot of jobs. It takes strong growth to really fill in that output gap. And so that's the thing that worries me. Do we limp along at the 3% kind of growth, or do we see the kind of strong growth that would get us back to something much closer to normal? That's what I'm going to be focused on, and that's why I think the emphasis on what more can we do to speed this up, I think, is important.